Hello, in this video I'm going to be going over the triggers that are required to complete the level Coastal Highway. So I'm going to be mainly focusing on the triggers along the highway, and this isn't going to be sort of a full tutorial on how to do this without cheats in a speedrun setting. It's just going to be basically going through and visualizing the different triggers and explaining how they work and how we're able to stay out of bounds when hitting the triggers versus getting sucked back in bounds. So this is a quick overview of the triggers that we're going to have to be hitting, as well as a couple load zones along the way. So we're going to start off with this first trigger here, which we normally hit inbounds, but for completeness sake, I'm going to start with this first trigger and we're going to progress through to the ending. And then we've got a couple of extra triggers to look at that are just going to provide some extra information. So here we are at the first trigger. So I like to refer to the door where you spawn out of the cutscene, that's sort of door 0. And then door 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on around the rest of the highway. So this is door 1. Normally in a speedrun setting, we're hitting this trigger inbound, but what we're going to be using this as an example of what the triggers in these out of bounds sections are and how they work and what they look like. So the big flashing yellow box is the main trigger that we're looking to hit, and this is what is required to progress the level. The flashing yellow indicates when it's checking to see if the player is within that trigger volume. So this green orb here needs to be within that trigger volume for the trigger to register. And the flashing yellow is just indicating the cycle at which it's checking. So it's checking multiple times a second, so fast that it just looks almost solid yellow. But some triggers are checking once a second, so you can actually see the individual flashes. But effectively, as soon as we enter this trigger, it's going to register that we've entered it, and it's going to progress the level. And in this case, the trigger is very, very big, as we can see. So it covers the inside of the highway, and it also extends quite far out. And we just have to hit any part of this trigger to progress the level. However, usually we want to be hitting this while we're out of bounds. And you can see here that if we just fly into the trigger anywhere, for example, we get teleported inbounds. So you can see the green flash there to indicate that I've hit the trigger, and now I've been teleported back inbounds. So if we go back here and have a look, we can see just once again, fly in here anywhere, hit the trigger, green, indicate we hit the trigger, teleported back in bounds. So to avoid being teleported back in bounds, the way it works is the game is checking to see that A, you've entered the trigger, and then B, soon after, basically immediately after, it checks to see if the player is also within this secondary volume here. Sort of referred to as the P-safe volume as per this label. So it means that when we enter this big trigger, to avoid getting sucked back in bounds to that known location on the map at each door along the way, we have to make sure that we're in both volumes at the same time. So we're going to be making a checkpoint here, and we can see that this volume here sort of extends past this solid line here, and we're able to be in both volumes at the same time if we walk through here. So we can see two flashes. One is for that main trigger. The second one is the check to see if we're in the P-safe volume. So if I'm outside of this P-safe volume and I hit the trigger, the game's going to do that secondary check, realize we're not inside the P-safe volume, and teleport us back to a known location inside the map. So specifically for this first trigger here, we need to be down this ramp so that we're low enough to enter the P-safe volume, but not too far that we go out the side. So if we're up top here, and say we hit the trigger there, you can see that I was too high, and I hit the main trigger but wasn't inside the P-safe volume. But if we come down this ramp a bit, we can find a bit of a sweet spot where we can be in both triggers at the same time. So you'll see the first green flash is the main trigger, and the next green flash is that P-safe volume check. Do note there is a slight delay between the two, but it's basically one right after the other. So that determines how to hit these triggers while also staying out of bounds. And this is the first door that we normally hit inbounds, but we'll be going through the rest of the doors now to briefly show over how these trigger volumes overlap, so how you can hit them without getting teleported back inbounds. Again, this won't be a full proper tutorial on how to, say, do the driving throughout the whole out of bounds section and things like that. It's going to be more a visualization of the triggers and how they work. So on to door 2. So we're at the second door now, and as we can see, again, big trigger volume checking periodically. but we also need to be within this P-safe volume to not get brought back in bounds after hitting the main trigger. So in this case, P-safe volume extends quite high, and it is across the sort of middle part of this door. So we can't go too far to the side, otherwise we get teleported back in bounds, but we can go more central and we can be in both volumes at the same time. So in this case, when we're driving, we can just drive through the middle and we'll be in both volumes at the same time and we won't get teleported back in bounds. So we're at the third door now. Again, massive trigger, P-safe volume, but before we get to that, we're going to be looking at this load zone trigger. So it extends out to the end of this flat part here and sort of starts alongside this ledge. So we just need to make our way into this blue trigger here to hit that loading done, and that loads the next part of the map. So you can see that blue volume here as the load zone trigger. Again, now onto the main triggers. This is door 3, looking at the P-safe volume, relatively tall over the middle part of this doorway. So as we're driving along, we're doing the same as we were before. After we've hit the load zone, we then can go through the middle part of this door, green, and we're not being teleported in bounds. So we're at door 4 now. Again, same massive trigger volume. In this case, the P-safe volume is a lot shorter, so we're unable to just go on top of the building and be in both volumes at the same time. So in this case, we need to go to the slanted part of this building so that we can fall a bit further down, so we can be down within the P-safe volume. Can't go too far to the side, otherwise we'll be outside and we'll get teleported back in. So roughly somewhere between here and here, we're low enough so that our interaction point is inside both triggers at the same time. Here, green, and then good to go. We're at door 5 now, massive trigger volume, P-safe volume in this case does extend high above the building, again straight through the middle part of the building, so we're able to, in this case for example, drive straight over the top. One thing to note is that you can see the P-safe volume here, it's a little bit further to the left and doesn't extend that far to the right, so you don't want to drive into that corner right here, because you can sort of hit the first trigger but not be inside the P-safe volume. So you just want to give it a little bit of extra room to be able to sneak in this part where you're in both triggers at the same time. And off we go. Door 6 now, very similar story to before. P-safe volume high enough that we can just drive over the top. In this case it does extend far enough across that we can just fall inside this gap here and be within both at the same time. And we're good to keep going. So we're at door 7 now. Again, main trigger. P-safe volume here sits a bit lower. So we just need to be careful to go to the sloped part of this wall so that we're low enough to be inside the P-safe volume. Roughly around here is pretty safe. One thing to note is that this main trigger is slightly further inside the building than most of the other main triggers. So you have to be quite far in before you actually hit that trigger. So when driving in this vehicle, we can do the exact same thing as if we're walking. Interaction volume sitting between both trigger volumes, green, and we're good to go. So we're at door 8 now, also known as the Banshee door. So in this case, we've got another load to hit. So this one doesn't sit so far across, sits roughly just past this line here on the texture. And again, it does sit roughly along this line here. So we just have to make our way roughly to here and we've hit the loading done, or anywhere else within this loading trigger. The P-safe volume in this case also sits a little bit low, so we're not able to hit it just by going over the top. We have to go to the sloped part of the building and get to a point where we're low enough to be in the P-safe volume without going too far to the side where we're past it. So safe spot is roughly here, looking for green, and we're now hit the main trigger and the P-safe volume in the same spot, so we're not being teleported in bounds. So we're at door 9 now. In this case, the P-safe volume extends roughly above this white strip, so anywhere in this space here, pretty safe to hit both at the same time. We're at door 10 now. Again, the P-safe volume sits a bit lower than the height of the door, so we just need to fall our way into this gap here, where we're within both the P-safe volume and the main trigger. One thing to keep in mind is this trigger does extend a bit more out from the building than some of the other triggers, and we can hit it just like we did there, walking into both at the same time, or just driving into both at the same time, like that. Tick tick, off to the next door. So we're at door 11 now. One thing of note is this main trigger is a lot shorter. There's also a load zone that effectively overlaps with the main trigger, so a little bit difficult to miss this one. P-safe volume sits above the building, so it makes it relatively simple to drive along and sort of hit all three triggers basically together. Loading done, main trigger and the P-safe volume all hit. So we're at door 12, the last door now, and now I'm going to show the remaining triggers from this door onwards. So this one isn't as picky as to where we hit the trigger. We can effectively hit it anywhere. So I'm going to be showing the rest of this just with acrophobia, but you could be driving along, hit that trigger. We need to land in front of this doorway here to hit this trigger, and you can see we're going to be progressively hitting the remaining mandatory triggers. Next one sits just in front of this ramp, so we've just hit that one there. There's now these two trigger volumes that are effectively the same trigger. It's either down here in this middle space or just on the outside of this space here. Another progressive one halfway through this firefight area, and then we've got the last two triggers here before the start of the end fight. So the first one is the trigger volume that the player needs to be in to sort of kick off the end fight sequence. So we need to get into this trigger volume, and then these two grunts need to be dead, and Buck needs to be within this smaller fight start volume for the end fight to start. So in this case, we're ahead of Buck. We haven't got him with us, but he will eventually teleport as sort of a soft lock prevention mechanism into this start volume. And now with these grunts dead, Buck here, the end fight section starts. Last requirement before the enemies arrive is that Dare also enters that fight start volume just the way that Buck did. So it does help to try and get Dare to that start volume sooner so that we can progress to the next section of the end fight. So once she's into that volume, you can often get a checkpoint and the Phantom will then spawn in. From here, we're then clearing out all the enemies. And once all the enemies are done, friendly Phantom flies in, hovers over this Phantom pickup volume, and once all the enemies are dead and the Phantom's in place, it's then this Phantom pickup volume that will then activate. Pretty generous and large volume, so just anywhere in here, and the end of the mission will trigger. So that's the rest of the coastal highway triggers from the first cutscene, mid-level cutscene, through to the end of the mission. Just when you're going over a couple other secondary sort of triggers that are sort of note for the purposes of the speedrun of this level. So in this case, we're going to be looking at the barrier overlays, which is the green that you're seeing. This is the volumes that describe where the barriers are. So you can see I can't fly above this building when I'm using acrophobia because this green barrier is holding me in place. And we're also going to be looking at the kill volumes, which are in the red. So these are sort of the instant kill volumes that if the player is in any of these volumes when they flash yellow, then the player will be killed. So this is the first door out of the cutscene, so door 0. And just going to highlight why it's a little bit infeasible to look to get out of bounds here in this section of the highway, or at least why it's more challenging, particularly without acrophobia skull, to try and get out of bounds. So in this case, we can see there's a kill volume that sits quite high. So it sits up here pretty close to the top of the barrier. And we can see that just here in the top left, you'll see trigger hit on tick 5,000 or so. And that's the kill volume detecting that I'm in this space and it would normally kill me, but I've got the invulnerability cheat on. So to get out of this kill volume, you do need to be quite high up this ramp. So if you just take visual marker, I am roughly past this third line up the ramp for me to be outside of this kill volume. Whereas the barrier also starts about here. So as a player, I can walk around without being at risk of dying to the kill barrier or being stuck in the barrier, and roughly about this much space here on this ramp. So it makes it a little bit challenging to sort of get a vehicle out here to help us get out of bounds past this barrier. bit more feasible with acrophobia and maybe other cheats and skulls and things like that. But sort of in the base game modifiers, it's difficult to complete a trick in this amount of space. Whereas if we take a look in the other part of this first highway section, where the tricks are typically done for getting out of bounds, that sort of kill volume that sits high above this barrier, this physical barrier here, this screen, is not there. It actually sits a lot lower. And that means that we actually have more space before we're interacting with the soft barrier. So up here we're hitting the soft barrier, but normally we would only have to about here before we're in the kill volume. Where in this case we have to about here, and you'll start seeing the indicators on the top left that I've now entered the kill volume from down here. So we've got this much space to be able to work with to get vehicles over here and other things to help us break through the soft barrier. So it's a lot more feasible to get out of bounds with this much space to work with and to break through this barrier. So that's just sort of an indication as to why this is potentially the best place and most feasible place to get out of bounds. In terms of other spots, you can see here there's this kill volume here, which mirrors the setup at door 0, where it sits quite high above the doorway and makes it a bit more challenging to get out of bounds. So further along the highway, there might be other points similar to this, where the kill barrier sits quite low and there's more space to be able to get out of bounds, but this is the most convenient and one of the earliest locations to do that. So that's typically why out of bounds tricks would be looking to utilize that ramp there. Even though it's a bit later in the level, it's a lot more feasible with the kill volume and soft barrier. So the last thing I want to show is these two triggers here in the first section of the mission. So this first volume here is not actually mandatory or anything like that for completing the level, but it does dictate the spawn for the grunts that are sitting on the top of this turret tower in this firefight section here. So the other 4 grunts, for example, they're spawned right from the start of the level. So they're chilling over here, they're all spawned, but it's only once the player enters this volume here that the grunts up here spawn. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to re-enable my game inputs and disable the camera input, and I'm going to hold forwards, and we're going to see that once I walk into the trigger, those grunts spawn on that tower. So the reason this is relevant is a potential RNG manipulation for plasmonade drops from the grunts. It's looking a little bit infeasible to be able to try and get those grunts on the tower to be able to drop plasmonades consistently or more often, because roughly the way that RNG works in this game, and there's probably opportunity for more science in this space, is from the cutscene skip, the game is constantly changing the RNG value based off player input. So if you can consistently apply the same inputs from the cutscene, from when the cutscene starts, through the game, you will get a consistent level of RNG based off the initial seed value, which is determined when you load up the mission. So for those first 4 grunts, if you compress the same inputs through the cutscene and skip the cutscene on the same frame every time, the chance of them spawning with grenades should be consistent. Like it should be whatever the RNG value gives you, it should give you the same RNG every single time. Whereas those other grunts on the turret, you'd have to provide the game with the same inputs all the way through to hitting this trigger. So that should include all movement controls as well as look angles and weapon switching and nade throws and things like that. So it's a little bit less feasible to try and provide the exact same inputs to the game all the way through to this trigger, such that those grunts will produce nades with the same RNG compared to those 4 grunts on the side, which should just require constant inputs from the cutscene skip onwards. Small aspect to note is that the grunts and other enemies as well, there's a initial RNG roll to see if they will spawn with grenades, and then upon death there's another RNG roll to determine whether they actually drop their grenades. So in the fact that I got no grenades dropped here might mean that the grunts never initially spawned with grenades, or it could just mean that I didn't get the RNG roll for them to actually drop their grenades that they spawned with. So there's still a second level of RNG that would need to be factored in, but Potentially there could be some value in guaranteeing that the grunts spawn with grenades in the first place, and then you only need a second level of RNG to get the grenades from those grunts. So a lot more work to be done here and try and make anything useful or consistent from this knowledge. Just trying to highlight the difference between the two packs of grunts and the ways in which they spawn in this trigger volume. Last thing I'm going to show off is this trigger to progress into the cutscene halfway through this level. So in this case, this trigger is constantly active and can be hit at any time to progress into the cutscene. Typically in solo, we're looking to wait for Virgil to activate this button, which is a secondary way to activate this trigger and enter the cutscene. So one option is to wait and hit this button. The other option that we can do in co-op with spawn bumps, for example, is we can just teleport, or in this case spawn bump, into that trigger volume to hit the cutscene straight away. So if I find my force teleport button here, I can teleport into this trigger and it'll progress our way into the cutscene. So that's a secondary way to trigger the cutscene that can most viably hit using co-op tricks. But potentially could be a way to hit that trigger solo. Bonus trigger time. So the absolute last trigger that I wanted to show off was this affectionately named Engineer Jerk volume. So this is a volume that actually dictates when Virgil moves towards the door to begin activating the cutscene button. So you could be really close to the door, like over here, and Virgil actually won't start moving until you enter this trigger volume, and now Virgil will start moving towards that door. So slight optimization is to approach this door slightly to the left, so that we hit this trigger here to begin Virgil's sequence to walking towards the door.
This way. Should be an elevator right through here.
And that's all the triggers I wanted to show off in this video. So big shout outs to Bernd for putting together the Halo Checkpoint Manager, which has this trigger overlay feature, which we've been able to use to show off all of these triggers live in game. I'll put a link in the description of where you can download the Halo Checkpoint Manager, as well as a list of all the triggers that I've shown us in this video, so you can add them to the whitelist section, so that it will filter down and just show the relevant triggers for when you may wish to try and load up the Checkpoint Manager and load up these triggers and play around and see this all in game for yourself.